Before Scotland became a nation, it was a battlefield soaked in blood. Viking longships appeared from the fog. Warriors who had never known mercy came to take everything: land, gold, women, and children. The Scots didn't just fight back. They became something just as terrifying. This is the story history forgot to warn you about. A land divided, before the storm. Long before the name Scotland ever existed, the land now known as it was a shattered puzzle of warring tribes, ancient grudges, and rival kingdoms. Two great peoples dominated this rugged, windswept land, the Picts and the Scots. The Picts were the original people of the north, fierce, ancient, and terrifying in battle. The Romans had called them Picti, meaning the painted ones, because they charged into combat nearly naked, their bodies stained blue with woad dye, screaming war cries that made even seasoned legionnaires hesitate. They did not build great cities. They built forts on cliffs, carved symbols into standing stones, and died defending every inch of their highland soil. The Scots, on the other hand, were a Gaelic-speaking people who had come across the sea from Ireland. They had carved out a kingdom called Dalriata, which stretched across both western Scotland and northern Ireland, a maritime kingdom of warriors who lived and breathed the ocean. They were fierce traders, fierce fighters, and fiercely proud of their identity. Between these two peoples, there was blood. There were treaties. There were marriages. There were betrayals. And for generations, neither side could dominate the other completely. Meanwhile, in the monasteries scattered across Scotland, in places like the sacred island of Iona, monks quietly copied manuscripts, kept the flame of Christian civilization alive, and stored gold relics, jeweled crosses, and centuries' worth of accumulated wealth. And far away, across the cold grey waters of the North Sea, something was stirring. The dragon ships arrive. In the year 793 AD, the world changed. Viking longships struck the monastery of Lindisfarne on the northeastern coast of England, and the news spread like wildfire across Christian Europe. Monks were slaughtered at the altar. Sacred relics were smashed. Gold was ripped from gospel books. The sea, once a divine barrier from danger, had become a highway for monsters. 2 years later, in 795 AD, the horror arrived on Scotland's doorstep. The monastery of Iona, perhaps the holiest place in the Celtic Christian world, founded by Saint Columba himself, was attacked. The Vikings came silently from the ocean mist at dawn. By the time the monks realized what was happening, it was already too late. The raiders moved with terrifying speed and organization. They knew exactly what they wanted: gold, silver, portable wealth, and slaves. Monks who could not run fast enough were cut down where they stood. Those who surrendered were chained and dragged to the ships. The beautifully illuminated manuscripts, the relics, the chalices, all taken or destroyed. The sacred island of Iona was burned. It would be raided again in 802, and again in 806, when 68 monks were massacred on a beach that was afterwards called Martyrs Bay, a name that endures to this day. But these early raids were just the opening act. The real horror was still coming. Deeper and deeper, the Vikings take hold. Unlike their smash-and-grab raids in England, the Vikings who came to Scotland were not merely passing through. They looked at the Northern Isles, Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides, and they saw home. The land was familiar, cold, rocky, coastal, fjord-like. The fishing was excellent. The farming, while difficult, was possible. And the existing population of Pictish and Celtic people was thinly spread, disorganized, and constantly fighting amongst themselves. The Vikings settled. They built longhouses from stone, since Scotland lacked the massive timber forests of Scandinavia. They brought their wives, their livestock, their gods, and their language. Within a generation, the Northern Isles were transformed. Pictish place names disappeared, replaced by Norse ones. The people of Orkney stopped speaking their ancestral language and began speaking Old Norse. The native population did not vanish. Some fled. Some were enslaved. Some, and this is the part that surprises most people, simply merged with the newcomers. Viking men married Pictish women. Norse farmers traded with Gaelic fishermen. A new hybrid culture emerged, the Gorgoidal, or Norse-Gaels, people who carried Norse blood, Norse names, Norse weapons, but also spoke Gaelic and followed Christian practices. They were not fully Viking. They were not fully Scottish. They were something new, and something uniquely dangerous. From their new island bases, Viking war parties launched raids deep into the Scottish mainland. They sailed up the wide river estuaries, the Clyde, the Tay, the Forth, and struck at settlements far inland. No village near water was safe. Parents began telling their children not to play near the shore. The sound of a distant horn on the water meant one thing only: run. The Great Catastrophe of 839. In the year 839 AD, disaster struck the native kingdoms of Scotland at an unprecedented scale. A massive Viking fleet sailed into the heart of Pictish territory. The Viking commanders had apparently learned that the kingdoms of Fortriu and Dalriata were preparing to push back against Norse expansion. So they struck first, and struck with overwhelming force. The two most powerful rulers in Scotland, King Egan mac Iengusa of Fortriu and King Ed mac Boantar of Dalriata, both died in the battle. Their armies were shattered. Their warriors lay dead across the fields of Fortriu. The battle was so devastating that it effectively destroyed both kingdoms simultaneously. The power vacuum left behind was immense, and into that vacuum stepped a man named Kenneth mac Alpin. The man the Vikings accidentally created. Kenneth mac Alpin is remembered today as the first king of Scotland. But history's irony is that he would likely never have had the opportunity to unite the Picts and Scots if the Vikings hadn't destroyed the existing power structure first. Taking ruthless advantage of the chaos, Kenneth moved quickly. He was a king of Dalriata. Some say he may even have had Pictish blood himself through his mother's line. But whether through negotiation, military conquest, or outright treachery, and dark medieval legends say he murdered Pictish nobles at a feast by having them seated over hidden pit traps, Kenneth absorbed the Pictish kingdoms one by one. By 848 AD, he was being called king of both the Picts and the Scots. The two ancient rivals had been forged into one people. Not because they chose unity, but because the Vikings had left them with no other choice. The new unified kingdom was called Alba. It would eventually become Scotland, but the Vikings were not done. The horror on the rivers. While Kenneth and his successors worked to consolidate their kingdom, Viking war bands continued their campaigns of terror. And they had evolved their tactics. Early Viking raids had been coastal smash-and-grabs. Now the Norsemen were using river systems to penetrate deep into the Scottish heartland. They built smaller, shallower boats specifically designed to navigate inland waterways. A Viking force could appear 50 miles from the coast with no warning whatsoever. In 866 AD, Norse forces seized the great city of York in England. They established a Viking kingdom there, Jorvik, and used it as a launching pad for further operations. Scottish communities along the Lothian border now faced the terrifying prospect of Viking attack from the south as well as the north and west. The raids were not just about gold anymore. They were about people. The Viking slave trade was one of the most profitable enterprises of the medieval world. A healthy young Scotsman could be sold in Dublin, which had become a major slave market, or transported as far as the markets of Byzantium or the Arab world. Women and children were especially valuable. Entire villages were depopulated, not killed, but taken. Chained and carried across the sea to be sold to strangers in lands they would never leave. The psychological impact on Scottish society cannot be overstated. Communities lived in a state of permanent anxiety. Watchtowers were built on headlands. Signal fires were prepared. But the Vikings were expert navigators and expert tacticians. They came when the weather was too rough for watchers to keep proper lookout. They came at night. They came from unexpected directions. It was a war without front lines. It was a war without warning. And it lasted for generations. The Scots learned to fight back. Slowly, painfully, the Scots adapted. The new kings of Alba were not passive rulers waiting to be raided. They were warlords in their own right, and they learned from watching the Vikings. They built their own fleets. They fortified coastal positions. They developed a system of rapid response, local nobles responsible for mustering warriors at short notice, so that raiding parties could be intercepted before they could escape back to sea. They also developed something arguably more important: intelligence networks. The Norse-Gael communities on the Western Isles often served as go-betweens, tipping off the Scottish crown about planned Norse movements in exchange for political favors and land grants. The Viking world, it turned out, was not monolithic. There were rivalries and grudges within Norse society, and the Scots became expert at exploiting them. King Constantine II of Scotland, who ruled from 900 to 943, was perhaps the greatest practitioner of this new strategic approach. In 902 AD, Dublin Norse forces invaded his kingdom. Constantine met them in battle at Stratha-Ren and drove them back. In 904, at the Battle of Strathern, Scottish forces killed Emir Ua, a descendant of the legendary Ivo the Boneless, in open battle. For the first time in living memory, the Vikings had suffered a serious defeat on Scottish soil. But Constantine was no ideologue. When it served Scottish interests, he allied with Vikings against English enemies. When it served Scottish interests, he fought Vikings alongside English allies. The age of simple categories, Christian Scots versus pagan Vikings, was over. This was now a world of complex, shifting, ruthless politics. The last great Viking threat. The Viking Age officially ended in the mid-11th century, but in Scotland, Norse power never truly disappeared. The Northern Isles, Orkney, Shetland, remained under Norwegian rule. The Western Isles remained a contested zone, nominally under Norwegian sovereignty but governed by Norse-Gaelic lords who followed their own interests. By the 13th century, a new Scottish monarchy, confident, ambitious, and increasingly unified, decided it was time to end the Norse presence in Scotland once and for all. King Alexander II of Scotland began negotiations with Norway to purchase the Hebrides. The Norwegian king Haakon IV refused. Alexander began military operations, sending raiders into Norse-controlled island territories. Then Alexander died, and his son, the young Alexander III, continued the project with even greater ruthlessness. According to Norse accounts, Scottish forces raiding Norse-speaking islands committed acts of extraordinary brutality. They burned villages and churches. They killed men, women, and, the chronicles say without flinching, children. It was a deliberate policy of terror, designed to destabilize Norwegian control of the islands and force a decisive confrontation. Haakon was furious. He was not a man accustomed to being defied. In the summer of 1263, he assembled the largest Norwegian fleet seen in generations. Some accounts claim up to 120 longships and between 15,000 and 20,000 warriors. It was a force comparable in scale to the Spanish Armada 3 centuries later. The fleet sailed south through the Hebrides, extracting oaths of loyalty from island lords, sometimes willingly, sometimes at sword point, and anchored in the Firth of Clyde by late September. Haakon intended to overwinter in Scotland and campaign the following spring, crushing Scottish resistance systematically. Alexander III had different ideas. The storm, the beach, and the last battle. Alexander was only 23 years old, but he was already a master of strategic patience. He refused to meet the massive Norse fleet in open battle. Instead, he sent envoys, diplomats empowered to negotiate, to delay, to talk endlessly while autumn deepened and the weather deteriorated. He was buying time. Because he knew something Haakon did not fully appreciate. Scottish weather in October is not your friend. On the night of October 1, 1263, a massive North Atlantic storm struck the Norwegian fleet anchored off the Cumbries. The sea exploded. Waves drove ships toward the rocky Ayrshire coastline. Norwegian sailors fought desperately to control their vessels, but the fury of the storm was beyond any seamanship. Several ships were driven aground at the mainland town of Largs. Men drowned. Cargo and weapons were swept away. The once magnificent fleet was in chaos. In the morning, the Scots moved out a Scottish army, cavalry, spearmen, archers, drawn from Ayrshire and neighbouring counties, marched to Largs at speed. They found the Norwegians divided, one group on the beach trying to salvage wrecked ships, another smaller group positioned on a nearby mound. The battle that followed was not the epic clash of legend. It was messy, brutal, and confused. The Scots drove between the two Norwegian groups, threatening to cut them off from each other. The smaller group on the mound, seeing the Scots advance, ran back toward the beach, and the Norwegians on the beach, seeing men running, assumed it was a retreat and fled to the ships. In the panic and confusion, the Scots inflicted serious casualties. The Norwegians regrouped on the ships but were exhausted, their supplies depleted, their morale shattered. Haakon sailed north to Orkney to overwinter and regroup. He fully intended to return in the spring. But fate had made its own decision. Haakon IV, nearly 60 years old, fell ill in the cold Orkney winter. On December 16, 1263, he died in Kirkwall. The last Viking king to threaten Scotland was dead. And his son, Magnus the Lawmender, had no appetite for an expensive, embarrassing continuation of the war. In 1266, by the Treaty of Perth, Norway sold all claims to the Hebrides and the Isle of Man to Scotland. The Viking Age in Scotland, which had begun with fire and screaming on the holy island of Iona in 795 AD, ended quietly with an ink signature on parchment, 471 years later. What the Vikings left behind. The Norse did not simply disappear from Scotland. They became Scotland. The Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland, remained Norwegian for another 2 centuries, finally passing to Scotland in 1468–69 when the Norwegian king pledged them as security for his daughter's dowry and never paid the ransom. Across the mainland and islands, Norse blood ran in Scottish veins. Thousands of place names across Scotland are of Norse origin. Wick from the Norse Vik, Bay, Dingwall from Thingvolla, Assembly Field, Lags itself from Hlag, Can. The Lewis chessmen, those extraordinary medieval chess pieces found in the Outer Hebrides, were carved by Norse-Gael craftsmen who embodied both worlds. The Gaelic language absorbed Norse words. Scottish culture absorbed Norse practices. The fierce independence of the Highland clans, the maritime traditions of the Western Isles, the warrior ethos that would define Scotland for centuries, all of it was shaped, at least in part, by the centuries of conflict and coexistence with the Vikings, and perhaps the most extraordinary legacy of all, Scotland itself, the unified kingdom, the single nation, would not have existed without the Viking invasions. The catastrophe of 839, which destroyed both Pictish and Scottish kingdoms simultaneously, was the crisis that forced Kenneth MacAlpin to act. The threat of Norse domination was the pressure that welded rival tribes into a single people. The Vikings came to destroy Scotland. Instead, they created it. The horror history forgot. We tend to remember the Vikings as adventure story characters, bold explorers, skilled craftsmen, even enlightened lawmakers in their own Scandinavian societies. And all of that is true. But to the people who lived through their raids in Scotland, they were something else entirely. They were the sound of oars in the dark. They were a horizon full of sail at dawn when you were unarmed and your children were asleep. They were the chains around your wrists as you were dragged to a ship you would never leave. They were the burning thatch of your home, the screams of your neighbors, the silence afterward that was somehow worse than the screaming. The conflict between the Vikings and the Scots lasted nearly 5 centuries. It shaped every aspect of Scottish culture, identity, politics, and geography. It produced some of the darkest chapters in the history of any European nation, and some of the most extraordinary acts of resilience, adaptation, and survival. That it was not merely horrifying. It was the crucible in which Scotland was forged.